Alrighty, well, we'll get started. So I show that we just have one left on the chapter 16 practice, and then we'll wrap up chapter 16, and then Thursday we'll start 17. So we'll cover 17 Thursday and next Tuesday, and then next Thursday we'll have a homework day. So you'll have time to come and work on 15, 16, and 17 in class. So, you know, hopefully you're working on it as you go, and then if you have questions, we'll have time in class to look at that. So again, just to kind of recap, you know, we were dealing with chapter 16, which is dealing with job process costing. So again, our cost flows are the same. You know, they're still all in work in process. You're getting all of your product costs, materials, labor, and overhead. The only thing different now is that we're tracking costs job by job as well. So each job within work in process, it's going to have its own job cost sheet that we're tracking and charging materials, labor, and overhead to each specific job. So with that, we had to do applied overhead because we usually don't know our full monthly overhead costs until the end of the month. So we used our factory overhead account and we kept track of our actual overhead by debiting the factory overhead account. And then we calculated an applied overhead rate, usually based on like direct labor hours or something like that. And then we were able to apply overhead to each job within work in process. And that got debited to work in process and credited to factory overhead. And then at the end of the month, we would need to figure out if we over or under applied overhead. Too many overs in there, right? So that's kind of, you know, where we were going in this chapter. So again, from 15 to 16, your cost flows are the same between materials, work in process, finished goods, cost of goods sold. So the last one we're working on is doing the journal entries and keeping track of specific job costs. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the practice. Okay, so we should be on number 4, the last practice here. And again, we're going to basically do journal entries and look at schedules for unfinished jobs and completed jobs. So Hildreth Company uses a job order cost system. The following data summarizes the operations related to production for April, the first month of operations. So it tells us, you know, materials were purchased on account, and then they show us we have 6 jobs that we're working on in the month of April. And it tells us materials and labor for all 6 of those jobs. And then also it has for general factory use. So when it's for general factory use, what type of cost is that? Overhead. Very good. So then we're going to have indirect materials and indirect labor. So it's giving us all of the materials and factory labor used. And then C, it gives us factory overhead costs in addition to those. And we have depreciation, and then they tell us factory overhead rate is $40 per machine hour. And they give us all the machine hours used for the 6 jobs. We're just kind of going over the whole thing before we get started. And then F, jobs completed, 102, or 101, 102, 103, and 105. And then jobs that were shipped and customers were billed, 101, 102, and 105. So obviously with this one, we're going to have different jobs in different work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. So not only do we need to keep track of our total costs throughout the month, we also need to keep track of our job costs. Okay, so this one's a little bit bigger. Okay, so as you can see, we're going to journalize all of A through J, or G, sorry, A through G is going to be journalized. And then once we're done with that, we'll also have just some little T accounts and then put in our unfinished and completed jobs. Okay, that's kind of where we're going. Like I said, it's a big long one, I know, right? So, again, I like to start with the T accounts. I'll also have to keep track of job costs, but We'll start with our T accounts. You know we have materials, work in process, and finished goods. Let's see. We also have cost of goods sold. Okay. So part A, it says materials purchased on account. Well, where would I put that? Materials. Good. Is it a debit or a credit? Debit. Good. So on part A, when we purchase materials on account, I'm debiting materials $147,000. Okay. So we can do that journal entry. So materials get debited $147,000. What do I credit? Accounts payable. Very good. So accounts payable gets credited because it said we purchased materials on account. Okay, so our very first journal entry is a debit to materials and a credit to accounts payable. Then the fun begins. It says materials requisitioned and factory labor used. Well, this is broken down by job. So basically, in this month, all 6 of these jobs get put into work in process, right? We have each job coming in. So thankfully, there's no beginning balance, at least. But we need to figure out all of our costs, that flow in for materials and labor. So we're doing really like a good old compound journal entry here, where we're showing materials and labor all flowing into work in process. Okay, so let's break it down just so it'll make a little more sense. So we'll have direct materials, we have direct labor, right? Okay, so of that, when I look at this, what do I need to debit to work in process for materials? What would I add up?
Direct materials and direct labor?
Well, just materials though.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, just for direct materials, we would want it, we're going to put it all together, but I wanted to break it down.
Oh.
So just for the jobs, right? I would add up job 101 through job 106 materials. Okay. So I'm going to separate them. We'll put them as one compound entry, but just so you guys can kind of see how they're flowing. Okay. So I add all of those up. Let's see. I have that. How much are my direct materials?
230,
How much?
230, 110.
That seems too high. Maybe you added a 0. Oh, you're close. It's 130, 110.
130, 110.
Yeah. I'm like, wait, you're close. Yeah. Okay. So we know direct materials are flowing into work in process, 130, 110. And then they told us we also have like indirect materials. Where do I put indirect materials? Factory overhead. Very good. I forgot to write that one down. I'm going to run out of room, but that's okay. Remember, we have that factory overhead account. Any actual overheads get debited to the factory overhead. So we have an indirect material charge of $9,000. Okay.
Wait, where did we get the $9,000 from?
Right here for general factory use
Oh.
materials, yeah. Okay. So all total, we had 139,110 used in materials, right? 130, 110 went into work in process, 9,000 was indirect. So I'm going to show those separately over here too, just so it's easier to keep track of. Again, they're going to put them all together, but okay. So we had materials used, the total materials, all materials put into process was 139,110. 130, 110 was direct materials charged to work in process, and 9,000 was indirect materials charged to the actual factory overhead. Okay.
And why did you put it on the credit side?
This over here,
It's just what.
because it's what's, yeah, this is what we purchased, and this is what was used and put into.
That's what requisition is.
Uh-huh. Yeah. You got it. And then we do the same with labor, right? Well, we know easily indirect labor is 20,160. I need a new marker. So indirect labor gets charged to factory overhead, 20,160. How much direct labor do we have? Anybody have that calculated?
Is it 132,380?
That sounds right. Good. So 132,380, right? Yeah. So direct labor for jobs 101 through 106, 132,380. Okay. And we don't show it here, but that labor is getting charged as a credit to wages payable. Okay. So now we really have everything to do our second journal entry. They're going to do a compound entry where they're, not charging them each separately. So that's where it gets a little confusing. But I wanted to show you how it's broken down so you understand where they're getting this. So when we do journal entry B, well, all total, I have two different debits, right? I have a debit to work in process, and I have a debit to factory overhead. So I'm going to add these two up to get my total debit to work in process. They're doing it as a compound entry. So work in process for materials, direct materials and direct labor, I add those two together, 262,490. So work in process was debited 262,490.
So looking at the 132.
That was all of our labor for jobs 101 through 106.
Okay.
Yeah. And then factory overhead was debited a total of 29,160 for indirect materials and indirect labor. So factory overhead gets a debit of 29,160. 29,160. I guess I could show the wages payable. Just so you see the full. Okay. So we have our two credits. Work in process got debited for direct materials and direct labor. I said credits, two debits. Direct materials and direct labor, work in process. Factory overhead for both our indirect materials and indirect labor. So then on our credit side, well, we credited materials, right? We see that credit to materials. So total materials was 139,110. Materials is credited 139, 110. And then I know I'm kind of in the way, but labor, wages payable was credited for 152, 540 for the indirect and direct labor added together. So indirect labor plus direct labor, we credit wages payable 152, 540. 152, 540. Again, you know, I encourage you to use your T accounts when you're doing this and separate it out like this, because then you can you can actually see it, right? You can see direct materials versus indirect materials. You can see where they're getting that compound entry. Otherwise, to me, it gets a little confusing because I'm having to separate out indirect and direct, but I'm adding materials and labor together. So, you know, do it like this. It will really help. Any questions on that one? All right. That one was one of the tricky ones. Part C just says factory overhead costs incurred on account. Well, where would I put a factory overhead cost? It's not a trick question, I promise. It's an easy one. Factory overhead, yeah. Anytime they tell you an overhead cost and it, you know, that's an actual overhead. So when they're telling you factory overhead costs incurred, that's an actual overhead. So I just debit my factory overhead. And they don't tell us what it was for, but it's some kind of overhead cost. So I'm going to debit factory overhead, $6,000. And then it said on account, so I'm just going to credit accounts payable. The factory overhead gets debited and accounts payable gets credited for the $6,000 of actual overhead. How about part D, depreciation on machinery and equipment, $4,100. What kind of cost is that? Is it materials, labor, or overhead?
Overhead.
Overhead, very good, since it's dealing with the factory. So what do I need to do with it? Where would it go?
Debit factory overhead.
You-
Credit accumulated depreciation.
Perfect, that's right. So again, it's an actual overhead. So we're doing depreciation of what, 4,100. A debit, it's an actual overhead. So factory overhead gets debited 4,100, and we credit accumulated depreciation, machinery, and equipment. That takes us back, right? When we're doing depreciation in college accounting and financial accounting. So factory overhead's getting charged for that. Okay. So all actual charges, when they're known charges at the end of the month, they get charged as a debit to factory overhead. We're on part E. It says the factory overhead rate is $40 per machine hour. And then they give us the machine hours used. So right now we'll have to separate it out by job here in a minute because we have to calculate all of our job costs too. Yippee! But right now we're just doing our journal entries. So what would my factory overhead amount be that we charge, that we apply? If the rate is $40 per machine hour, what's the total factory overhead for the month? Yes, very good. 40,480. So we just took the total machine hours of 1,012 times the $40 rate. So they already gave us the overhead rate. So our total overhead is 40,480. And where would we put that applied overhead? Work in process. Very good. So remember, in work in process, we have direct materials, direct labor, and applied overhead. So work in process gets debited 40,480. What do I credit? Factory overhead. Very good. I think it's not my marker. I think they cleaned the board and I don't know what they're doing. Okay. So work in process gets debited and factory overhead gets credited for the applied overhead, 40,480. So a debit to work in process and a credit to factory overhead for applied overhead. Any questions on that? Okay, the next part I'm going to have to erase most of this actually because I need room to write the jobs. So we'll have to come back to the journal entries. But one thing I want to do before we erase it is just talk about this factory overhead. It's not in our exercise, but at the end of the month, we'll pretend we're all the way done before I erase it. At the end of the month, I would need to look at actual versus applied, right? Like the end of the month, our goal is factory overhead should be 0. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to add up all my actual overhead. So what would that be? Correct my math if I'm wrong here. 39,260. Okay, good. Yay! You never know, right? So again, sorry that the marker's not working on this part of the board very well. But my actual overhead was 39,260. I applied overhead at 40,480. So did I over apply or under apply? Over. Yeah, my applied is greater. I applied more than the actual charge. Yay. So again, at the end of the month, I don't think we don't do that journal entry. No. So at the end of the month, what I would do is I would calculate that amount. Well, how much did I over apply? Very good, 1,220. So I over applied overhead at 1,220. Well, basically what I want to do is zero out this account. Okay, right now it has a balance, a credit balance of 1,220, and that's over applied. Okay. When we over apply, what that means is we've charged the customers more than our actual costs. It's actually lowering our cost of goods sold because we overcharge them. So basically what we want to do is zero out this account. Well, to zero out an account, what do I need to do? If it has a credit balance of 1,220, what would I do to zero it out? Yeah, you just debited out the balance. Very good. So I'm going to debit it 1,220. I know that's like tiny, but that's going to zero it out, and I'm going to credit that to cost of goods sold. Okay. I don't know why we have 2 chairs in here now. So factory overhead gets debited, and cost of goods sold gets credited for the 1,220. Okay. So we over applied because we had an applied balance. Basically, the credit balance, when we have a credit balance, that means applied was greater. So we debit factory overhead to zero out factory overhead to start the next month fresh. And then we credit cost of goods sold because it's reducing the cost to us because we put the cost on the customers. Whoops. And again, these are estimates when we apply overhead, so it's okay. And then if it were the reverse, we would just literally flip it. If actual had been greater, we would just do the reverse of this journal entry. It would be charged to cost of goods sold because we didn't charge the customers enough. So again, the good way to remember it is whatever side is higher is the over, you know, and then you just want to do the opposite to zero it out. We didn't do an example like that, so I wanted to go over it. Any questions on that one? All righty. Everyone got all this? Because I'm going to erase it all, and hopefully my marker will work. Looks good when I photobomb my own writing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So this one's long, you know, that's why we have all class period. We'll get done before class is over, but still, that's a long one. So now comes the fun part. If you weren't having fun before, right? So now we need to keep track of all the jobs and all their different costs, because it tells us on part F, jobs completed were 101, 102, 103, and 105. And then G, we sold 101, 102, and 105. Well, we need to know the costs of each specific job so we can keep track. Well, what's still in work in process? What's in finished goods? What's in cost of goods sold? Okay. So we're going to keep track or add up all of our different job costs. Okay. Started with a lot of spins. So I have to start up here, right, on my materials and labor. So I'm literally just putting costs to the job. So materials for 101, 19,320. Put this out here. Direct materials, direct labor, overhead. And then labor was 19,500. 102, 23,100. And 28,140. 103, 13,440. And 14,000. 104, 38,200. 36,500. 105, 1850, 18,050, and 15,540. 106, 18,000, and 18,700. Okay. So those are all my materials and labor costs. Okay. But I have to also do overhead. So on number E, or letter E, we calculated the total overhead that was applied, the 40,480. Well, now we need to do it by job. It's very simple. It's just tedious, right, to go through and do all this. But all we're doing is taking machine hours per job and multiplying them by the 40-hour machine rate. Okay. What is my overhead for job 101?
$6,160.
Thank you. 6,160. How about 102?
6,400.
6,400. Very good. Thank you. 103.
5,040.
Thank you. 5,040. 104.
9,520.
Thank you, 9,520. 105? 6,400. And 106. 6960. Thank you. Okay. Well, now we just need to add them up, right? Again, tedious but easy. Simple math. So 101 should be 44,980. 44,980. 102 is 57,640. 57,640. 103, 32,480. 32,480. 104, 84,220. 84,220. 105, 39,990. 39,990. Excuse me. 106, 43,660. 43,660.
I have one quick.
Sure.
On the overhead ones, I saw how you got it, but do we just ignore indirect labor, indirect materials?
Well, remember those are actual. So yeah, when we're doing overhead for each job, this is what was charged to work in process. So it's our applied factory rate. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we will always, for jobs, we will always use the applied overhead amount. Okay. So the amount we debit to work in process. Good question. Any other questions on any of those? All right. Well, now we've done all the work. So now we just have to figure out, well, what jobs have been completed, you know, what the total cost is. So really what we're looking at, again, is kind of going back to our inventory accounts. Okay, we had work in process, we have finished goods. And cost of goods sold. Well, our total cost was over here as a debit to work in process, right? We had all of our costs in there. But now, if we have jobs that have been completed and moved out, they need to move into finished goods, right? And they told us on part F, this is when we get into part F, jobs completed were 101, 102, 103, and 105. So what that means is those 4 jobs are going to go out of work in process into finished goods. Okay, 101, 102, 103, and 105. Okay, 101, 102, 103, and 105. So those 4 costs are going to go out of work in process into finished goods. Okay, so 44,980 plus 57,640 plus 32,480 and plus 39,990. Anyone have that added up?
175,090.
Very good. $175,090. Okay, that's those 4 jobs going out of work in process, and they're flowing into finished goods. Okay. So all 4 of those jobs, debit to finished goods, credit to work in process. So when we do our journal entry, we're truly debiting finished goods and crediting work in process for the 175 and 90. So a debit to finished goods and a credit to work in process for 175,090. So when I'm looking at that, what that tells me is that job 104, it wasn't finished in the period, right? So 104 will still be in work in process. 106 will also still be in work in process. And yes, they'll still sit as debits in work in process. And yeah, we could show that here. So they will be debit balances still in work in process. Okay. So 104, 106 still in work in process. Out of the 4 jobs that we completed in the period, it told us we sold 3 jobs. We sold 101, 102, and 105. So again, what that means then is they're going out of finished goods and we're costing them out. Okay, so 101, 102, and 105. So 44,980, 57,640, and 39,990, which is a total of what, 142,610?
Now, these are the selling prices?
Yes, this is the cost of goods sold, not the actual sales price. So this is the cost of the goods, the finished jobs that we completed and sold. Yeah. So we're really on the second G cost there on the journal entry. So what we're saying is those 3 jobs were finished, we billed the customer, we shipped them out. So we move them from finished goods to cost of goods sold. So it's those 3 jobs, we added them up. So that's really our very last journal entry. We debit cost of goods sold and credit finished goods for the ones that were sold. 142,610. Okay. So 101 is cost of goods sold, 102 is in cost of goods sold, and 105 is in cost of goods sold. So what that means is 103 is our only job that's left in finished goods. Like kind of just 103, 32,480. So 103 is in finished goods. Okay. And then the only other thing that we need to do in the journal entries is recognize the sale. Well, I would just scroll up here to part G. They told us jobs were shipped and customers were billed as followed. Job 101, 62,900, plus 102 of 80,700, plus 105 at 45,500. So that was the price we charged the customer. That was our actual sales. So these 3 jobs were billed as followed, those 3 amounts. And we billed them. So what would I debit if I billed the client? What account? Very good. Accounts receivable gets debited for the amount that we billed them, which is all 3 of those sales prices added together, 189,100. And then we truly just credit our revenue account sales. Okay. Which one are you looking for, Barbara?
The one over on the finished goods.
This one?
Yeah.
32,480. It's just job 103. Job 103 at 32,480. It's all that's in finished goods at the end of the period. Yeah. Sorry.
It's okay.
It gets a little small and sloppy. Okay. You're welcome. So we have 6 jobs. 3 were completely sold. So they're 101, 102, and 105 were costed out to cost of goods sold, billed to the client, we're done. We had one left in finished goods, job 103, so that cost is sitting in finished goods and will become beginning finished goods for May. I think we're in April. And then we have, what, two jobs, job 104 and 106, sitting in ending work in process. So our work in process balance, if I can get that apart, are those two jobs. Okay. So now it just wants us to do the T accounts. But we already did these, so I'm just going to give them to you. We forgot to fill them in, and I erased them. So it's just going back to our journal entries. So in our work in process account, on journal item B, on B, we debited work in process 262,490. 262,490. That was all of our direct materials and direct labor. Okay. Yes. And that was in journal entry. If I look at my journal entry B, I'll see that work in process debit 262,490. So again, I just forgot to fill these in when I had them on the board. And then I have another debit to work in process on line E for applied overhead. So E, 40,480, 40,480. And on journal entry F, I credited work in process for jobs that were finished, 175,090, 175,090, which I actually show that there. I actually show this, it's just not the same. And then our balance in work in process, I'd add my total debit, subtract out my credit. Your balance should be 127,880. 127,880. And that matches what I have on the board. Those were jobs 104 and 106 that weren't completed. So our ending work in process is 127,880. As far as finished goods go, well, I show that. We debited finished goods on F. 175.90. And then we credited it 142,610 on part G. Credit 142,610. Ending finished goods balance is 32,480, which is just job 103. That was still in finished goods. So I guess I had most of it on the board still. Not too bad, right? Any questions on that? All right, this is a long one, right? So it says prepare a schedule of unfinished jobs to support the balance in the work in process account. Well, all they're saying is what two jobs are still in work in process? Very good. So I'm just showing 104 and job 106 and their costs. So 104 materials 38,200, 38,200. Labor was 36,500, 36,500. Overhead was 9,520. Whoops. Adding extra numbers in there. 9,520. And then job 104 was 84,220. 84,220. A little bigger there. And then 106. We had 18,000 in materials, 18,000 in materials. Direct labor was 18,700, 18,700. And overhead was 6,960, 6,960. And then our total cost was 43,660, 43,660. And then, of course, if we add them up, we get our work in process balance of 127,880. 127,880. So that's just putting the costs in, which we have track of. So that was pretty easy. And then finally, we're at the very end now, right? Schedule of completed jobs. Well, what's my only completed but not sold job? 103. Very good. So finished goods. This is the finished goods balance, the 103. So materials are 13,440. 13,440. Labor's 14,000. 14,000. And overhead is 5,040. 5,040. Total job cost 32,480. 32,480. Any questions on any of that? Any questions on chapter 16? Yes.
There's a question on the homework with an income statement.
Uh-huh.
Rather than a balance sheet. Do you want to go over it? Or should I just?
Did we not do one of those?
Do that?
I thought we did one. Maybe it was last chapter we did one. Yeah, look in your, it's actually in your 16 notes, the income statement. Let me see what yours looks like in your homework.
Oh, okay.
Let me see. What number is that, Danielle?
It's number 10.
Number 10. Oh, because you get a blank sheet. It's like, I don't have to do that. Just kidding. Okay. Okay, so you're preparing the income statement. Okay. Yeah, go off of in your chapter 16 notes on the second page. You have that income statement here. It should be pretty similar. Like you'll start with what is my income statement? Well, first of all, I have to put the label in, right? Let me see. Labels for the month ended June 30. Of course, mine are different numbers, I know. But so, make sure you put in for the month ended on your statement. Oh no, is it not June 30? Yeah. Oh, it's just June 30. Okay. So remember, you always start with sales. Oh, is it not? What? Did they call it something else? Revenues. Yeah, got to look at the labels, right? So yeah, you'll start with your revenues. What goes after revenues?
Cost of goods sold.
Very good. And what's revenue minus cost of goods sold?
It's the gross profit.
Very good. Gross profit. Okay. So you'd just be, I'd have to look at the instructions. They're down here. So they actually give you a lot of extra stuff on this one. I mean, it tells you sold goods for 1 million. This one's my numbers. I know y'all's are different, but it tells me my revenues and it tells me my cost of goods sold within here. So even though it gives you all the purchases and materials and labor and all of those, it gives you your cost of goods sold. So you don't have to calculate it. It's not as bad as it looks. You're really just putting it into an income statement form. So for mine, my revenues are what? Where did they go? 1,402,470. And then minus my cost of goods sold, 781,630. What? 781,630. So yeah, they actually, that one shouldn't be too bad because they give you that. So from gross profit, then you would take out like your selling and administrative expenses. I would need to, of course, subtract that to get gross profit, and then you would just put selling and administrative expenses. And for that, you have administrative expenses and selling expenses. So yeah, without doing all the math on mine, yours should look something like this when you're all finished. So you'd have your revenues minus your cost of goods sold equal your gross profit. You would list selling and administrative, list the greater amount first. So selling, then administrative, I would add them up. And then take gross profit minus selling and administrative to get income from operations. Can do the math real quick.
I know your income, because we have the same one.
Oh, we do? Did you get the same thing? Let's see. Or are all the numbers the same? Is it not an algorithmic one, maybe?
No, it's different.
Okay. You just lucked out, right? Yeah. I should have just had you come and do it then.
Okay.
You waited to tell me until I'd done all the work. Okay, so revenues minus cost of goods sold equal gross profit. I add up my total selling and administrative, take gross profit minus to get income from operations. Okay, so that's really the same from last chapter too. And again, it would be more tricky. The only way they throw the curveball at you is if you had to calculate cost of goods sold, right?
Can you also do B?
Do what?
From the same column, can you also do B?
Is there a B?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's me and C count.
Oh, the inventory balances. Oh, that's where you get to have fun. I knew it wasn't that easy, right? So on your inventory balances, you will have to use, just when we thought it was easy, right? So for that, you would need to go through and actually do your cost flows. So yeah, you would start with, where did my marker go? My board is older. I was going to go right on the board. It's like, I may not be able to do anything if they're right. So yeah, there you're really just going back through your cost flows. So yeah, you'd start with materials. Materials, you would show that you purchased, well, a purchase is a debit to materials, right? And then it said we use 340 and 60, so that's a credit. And that was direct materials, right? So yeah, there you just have to go through and do all your cost flows. Direct labor, 294,500. And then overhead applied, so you'd have to calculate that. Mine says applied factory overhead at a rate of 79% of direct labor.
So 17% of 294,500.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I'm just going to take 294,500 times 79%. So my applied overhead for mine is 232,655. And then it tells you what you transferred out of work in process, 819,120. So that goes into finished goods. You sold goods with a cost of 781,630. That goes out of finished goods and into cost of goods sold. So from there, I would just need to balance my 3T accounts. So it's not too bad. You don't have beginning balances and such, so that makes it a little bit better. So, you know, I would just take my debit minus my credit to get my ending balance in materials. Okay. So for me, my materials have a balance of 63,380.
Okay, this is a lot simpler than the last one we did.
Yes, yeah, because we don't have any beginning balances either, and you don't have to keep track of specific jobs.
Yeah.
So really, this one's more of a review from chapter 15, except for applying overhead, because it's not giving it per job. So, you know, you're really just balancing those 3T accounts. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Any other homework questions? Okay, yeah. All right. Well, you have 15 minutes. Feel free to leave or stay, right?